Thanks for having me and doing this together. The feeling's mutual. Really appreciate you setting this up and taking the time. So I'm excited to chat, and I'm sure there'll be a few extra golden nuggets that we didn't get to last time.
Yeah, of course. I was thinking of several because I came across a paper actually from the ACSM by Stu Phillips on frailty and muscle power. We'll get to
Yeah,
that one in a little bit
yeah,
further ahead in the conversation. But anyway, I think a good starting point, once again, and thanks again, man. I really do appreciate it, is to make a clear difference. Well, I thought about two questions specifically. One, what is the target audience or a position stand? And what is the difference between a position stand and, let's say, a systematic review, a meta-analysis? Could you please expand on those? No?
absolutely. So again, thanks everyone for joining too, and happy to hear what everyone has to say as well. But maybe just starting with what is a position stand? It's right in the title, and it's not something we see too often. So a position stand is when a governing body or leading organization officially makes their position or stance on a topic known. So in the case of this, the American College of Sports Medicine, which is the largest organization of sports medicine and exercise science professionals in the world. Um, a position stand on resistance training prescription is that organization's approved message of here's what we need, here's what we know about resistance training, and what's the best way to program and prescribe it for individuals. Now, who are those individuals that I know you mentioned, and we'll get back to it, but the target audience for this is the generally healthy adults. So people who are over the age of 18, generally healthy. Think of your average Joe or Jane walking down the street. Um, and really, the point of a position stand is that scientists do all the hard work of reading everything we know on a topic to come to a concise conclusion so that professionals in the space, people who are, in this case, trainers, maybe physical therapists, other professionals who see or train patients or clients, they can have an evidence-based input into their programming without needing to read the thousands and thousands of papers. So that's the point of a position stand. It's to be a tool for the practitioner to use so they know what the current evidence says on a topic. And cut me off anytime if stuff comes up. But just to your last point of a systematic review, meta analysis. So in research, we have the gold standard randomized double blind placebo controlled trial that many of us have probably heard of. And that's one study where we can look at the effect of an intervention on an outcome. A meta-analysis or systematic review is a way that we can combine the results of multiple randomized trials. In the case of a position stand, you can use different methods based on the amount of evidence available to come to well, I would say this position stand on a topic. And in many cases, you're using a meta-analysis or systematic review methodology because you've got so much research to synthesize into one paper. So you tell me if any of that, whatever's unclear, and we'll get as much into it as you'd like.
That actually segues to the next question that I wanted to ask you, because at least to my really limited knowledge, when we talk about exercise science, I don't know how to put it or frame it. It's not the same rigorous methodology as, let's say, other applied sciences, because, well, there are less participants, and let's put it this way, there is less stakes. Let's say
Yes.
we compare it to cancer research, to obesity
Yeah.
research. So what are the limitations that you faced as a lead author of a patient stand about exercise science, the
Yeah.
outcomes that you specifically look into?
You're exactly right. Where exercise science is not subject to the same regulation as pharmaceutical or drug trials. And for exactly the reason you mentioned, where we're not going to at risk of doing as much harm, right? Exercise, pretty commonly known that it's good for you. And it's also very accessible. Pretty anyone can exercise. You don't need some government clearance to import this drug and then test it. Exercise is exercise, so it's quite accessible to research. And the challenges that come with that are one, you with the lack of regulation, yeah, maybe in some cases the quality of every single study varies more. But the good thing is that you get this enormous wealth of data. So in some cases, if we're looking at ways to treat a particular disease with a pharmaceutical intervention, there might be 7 or 8 studies that have been done. Exercise is so accessible and so heavily researched that there are tens of thousands of studies that have been done. So there's the pros and the cons of this, and that's just the nature of the field.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's really interesting with that in mind to think about why did it take so long for the position stand to be updated from 2009 to 2020, and the sheer amount of papers that came out ever since, and the sheer amount of paradigm shifts that we had, rep ranges, for instance. I can only imagine how of a overwhelming task that was. So, what was the main reasons, if there is several reasons, for this really long gap between the 2009 and this position stand?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you're absolutely right. There was a long time, over 17 years between position stands. And it is worth highlighting just how much research came out in that time. There were in just that 17 years, there was another 30,000 articles published on resistance training. So that's a lot of new research. And with our method, we ended up including over 30,000 participants worth of data into these conclusions. So it's a massive undertaking, and the whole team that was involved, full credit to everyone across the board. It was a big effort, and I think something that's good to highlight is exactly the paradigm shift you mentioned, where why is there this big of a gap? I wasn't there during those 17 years. I'm not sure exactly why, but the important thing is that we now have the updated position stand. Because, like I said, the purpose of a position stand is to be a tool for practitioners to best inform their work with their clients or patients. And it's important that we have these position stands reflect our current scientific understanding. So, why it was that long, who knows? Your guess is maybe just as good as mine. But the fact that we have it now is important because all of that work over those 17 years and before can now be used to inform people's training programs.
Because I think it's super interesting when we compare the last this one just by the title, like we mentioned in the first right of this conversation.
Yeah.
2009, it's called Progression Models in Resistance Training, which it kind of implies that people are already engaging in resistance training, and
Yeah.
makes kind of let's say an emphasis on periodization, because it goes about classical periodization, nodular periodization, so on
Yeah.
and so. This time around, periodization itself is not really that relevant. And I
Mhm.
wanted to ask you about if this is something that you expected based on the research, and as your expertise as a coach, as a professor,
Yeah.
or is it something that took you, like, I would say by surprise, but a little bit off guard?
Yeah, let's if you, I think you hit on a lot of really important points right there, and I'll circle back to the
Yeah.
periodization, but I think one thing just to highlight is exactly that difference, right? Where the previous position stand was progression models, like and beautifully said as you did, implying that people are already training. 60% of people in North America do no resistance training. And that's higher, if not the same, in other parts of the world. So the vast majority of people that you walk by on the street do no resistance training. And we know resistance training is incredibly beneficial for our health and our performance. So it seems appropriate that we have a position stand that's considering the majority of people who are not doing any exercise. And that was the reason for kind of that shift in our focus. To the point on periodization specifically, that was one I I wouldn't say I was surprised, but I was curious to see what data came from our work, because this method that we use to construct the position stand is what we call a systematic evidence-based synthesis. That's a lot of big words, but essentially just what it means is that it's a reproducible way to go through all of the literature. So someone could follow the same method we did and theoretically come to the same results. It's not just an opinion, it is actually a systematic way of going through all this evidence. And I was not surprised, but by the finding on periodization, which for those who maybe haven't read the paper or seen it, periodization was not a big influence on whether someone would benefit or not from resistance training. And that didn't surprise me because of what we just said, in that so few people participate in resistance training, where we see in not just exercise, but so many fields. When someone goes from doing nothing to doing something, there's a huge benefit. And in the case of exercise, that's exactly it. If someone goes from doing no exercise to any exercise, regardless of the periodization scheme, they're going to have a massive benefit. And what periodization scheme they're training with isn't going to be the biggest mover of how much they benefit. Now, I will just say that, from my experience back in the days of coaching, so I was a strength coach for several NCAA athletic teams. Periodization is a very valuable tool, particularly when it comes to optimizing performance. But that is something where we are already, if we're looking at maximizing performance or particular gains for whatever event or sport, we are already in the major minority, the minority of people, where most people, it doesn't matter if they're optimizing their training. We need to get them doing any training. So that's kind of my thought on the periodization result.
And I'm well aware that that can be a whole conversation on by itself. But
Yeah.
I made an emphasis on periodization because, at least here in Mexico, and it's pretty much safe to say in Latin America, when people think about evidence-based training, evidence-based practice in exercise,
Yeah.
they mostly are thinking about those classical Russian models of periodization, like that's the science behind. But what science? There are no RCTs. It's like people really just came up with those ways of training. They adapted. They keep teaching it. And in reality, it's really hard to say if that even in trained populations could even have a benefit beyond, let's say, variation, beyond psychological. I don't know, benefits. I think it's really important because that when we circle back to the current position stand, kind of liberates our practice. You don't need to worry about stuff like this because most people, like you alluded, don't really go even to the gym. And that segues also perfectly to the next. Well, there are two. The first one is in the current literature, it, it extends up until 2026. What are the main limitations that you guys find? Is it the measure of the outcomes? Is it the duration of the studies? Is it the, I don't know, the main limitations that we need to be mindful of before jumping into conclusions?
Yeah, a great question there. So the main limitations, I would say, in the exercise field, in my view, has to do with what you mentioned off the top, with this lack of standardization for conducting these studies. And I'll flush this out a bit. Exercise, in my view, is one of the best, if not the best, single thing we can do for our health and, in many ways, performance. It is such a powerful intervention. However, it's hardly ever practiced or used in these scenarios where someone's health is so important, right? Like the average uh, the average student going through medical school gets about 2 to 3 hours of lecturing on exercise in the course of the entire med school over years, a couple hours tops. But exercise, we've got all this great data showing, it's just as effective as some of the pharmaceutical interventions or other things we can do for our health. Why is it not used more? And do think part of that is that because of how studies are done without this rigor, it can give the misperception that this research is low quality. By the standards that we judge a pharmaceutical drug, exercise isn't done to the same, high level of control and rigor. And I think that if we can improve the few fundamentals of things like pre-registering our trials, having these publications where it follows more of that, to keep using the example, like the pharmaceutical path, that you build this rigorous evidence base so that it's irrefutable, where how powerful exercise is, because I think in the long run, that will help it get incorporated into these settings where it can have such a huge impact on people's lives. The unfortunate thing is right now, if someone were to do these types of analyses and say, all right, we want to figure out what's the best intervention for, yeah, treating high blood pressure. We can compare this drug, this type of exercise, this type of exercise. The exercise trials are going to look like they're lower quality. They're going to be ranked lower quality, and that can impact how strongly exercise is recommended. So I think my biggest takeaway on limitations in the literature is some of that standardization that allows a rigorous evidence base to be built when it comes to actually making this form of this form of an intervention widely spread.
I think that it's really important for practitioners, not just for people in the research area, because in the so-called evidence-based community, we tend to just take whatever paper just got published, just got a little bit more noise, or if it fits our prior beliefs, and then we give it a little bit more weight that perhaps we should because of the limitations. And I think this just keeping that in mind,
Yeah.
the sample size, the way the outcomes were measured, and all these possibilities, I think
Yeah.
it's really important to keep in mind. The second question in regards to, let's say, all these barriers, it's actually about barriers, because I'm sure you are well aware of this paper because, well, for once, it has some of the best titles that I've ever seen in the research in the strength training research. It's called Raising the Bar, Public Health, which it's pretty cool that they named it that. We know about benefits. This is 2023 for the good people listening, so it's fairly recent. It's not only about muscles and bones, it's also about cardiovascular benefits,
Yeah.
psychological, neurological, metabolic benefits. So I'd like to think we are well aware of the many benefits of strength training, but that's when my question comes. What are the main barriers that people face and make them not go to the gym? What are the main barriers that you found in the literature? Because I think that's where we need to shift focus, at least in
Yeah.
my opinion.
I completely agree. And that, if people were to take one thing from this paper, is just that so many exercise programs work. Pick which one is best suited to you and go with that. And so the you're right. The benefits of exercise are so widespread, whether it be the mental health, the functional health, glucose handling, like insulin sensitivity. It goes on and on. All the benefits outside of strength and muscle mass that we think of. I think the barriers, looking at the literature to why people don't participate in exercise, the most frequently cited is time. People say, well, I don't have enough time to exercise. I would argue that in many cases, it's not a lack of time. We all have the same amount of time. It's more so a lack of prioritization for how important exercise is. There's enough great work that as practitioners, we can know, okay, you only need to do, like, if you really wanted, you could get away with a couple minutes of sprints a few times a week and a couple sets of compound lifts, and you've got most of the bang for your buck when it comes to, strength training and aerobic training. Um, so it doesn't take a whole lot, but what I think is a real barrier, particularly in resistance training, is a fear or not knowing how to start, right? Like running is maybe a little bit more conceptually digestible. I have shoes, I can go on a walk, I can jog a little bit. That's very easy. You exercise at gym, particularly in older adults, it can be intimidating, right? Where what do I do with all this equipment? Am I doing it right? I feel like I might get hurt lifting this weight. So the fear of not knowing how to do it is a real one. And I would round this out by saying what I think the most important thing we can do is make sure it's a learning process, learning how to practice resistance training as whether it be a formal coach or trainer or just a friend or family member of someone who wants to start. Know that it's going to be a couple months of introducing someone to this. You can show them how general movements should be performed, and kind of pick exercise programs or um, exercise sessions where they're going to want to keep coming back, because 30% of people drop out of resistance training within the first 2 months of starting, and most of those, well, they're never going to come back, or at least for a long time. And so I think it's so important that the first few months, it's just about making someone comfortable and that they keep coming back to train. So make them comfortable, make them adhere. And after 2 months of doing that, twice a week, they'll be up and running on their own. It's just we can't start too fast, too quick.
And I've seen countless times. I recall a friend I made at the gym. It was an elderly lady, a really kind lady. Used to like her, but then came a time I didn't see her anymore. Then I saw her again, and she told me that she really didn't enjoy strength training. It was not something for her. And that led me to think and to ask myself, why is that? And I think that it's because most people, well, 60% of people don't engage in resistance training. I guess more than that, are simply afraid even of the outcomes. If you like, we can go to the
Yes.
findings of the position stand. I think one that lends to this point I'm trying to make is hypertrophy,
Yeah.
because people tend to believe, and I guess this is a barrier in itself, that they're gonna get too bulky, too slow, they're gonna get injured, whatever, and they
Yeah.
have to train within certain rep ranges, these machines that they don't like, they don't enjoy. But the findings of the position stand, would you, let's say, give them a little bit of peace of mind in regards to this particular adaptation?
Yeah, well, just practically, and you could speak to it better. It's tough to build muscle.
Yeah.
It takes a long time, and it is not easy. So before you get all bulked up, and you're going to need to be redoing your wardrobe, there is hours and years of work to work that you would have to do before getting to that point. Um, what I would say, though, with respect to the position stand findings, the one finding, if people take anything from it, any exercise is better than none. It sounds, simple, and it is. Uh, Across the board, whether it be for strength, hypertrophy, power, physical function, when people go from doing no exercise to doing some exercise, there's tremendous benefit. And hopefully that is liberating, like you're saying, where people are able to realize, okay, you know what? I can train with elastic bands. I could train at home. I could do such a wide variety of things and still benefit all of these areas that I'm going to pick the one that's best suited to me as an individual. And that's the biggest result. On hypertrophy, so of course, any exercise will help with hypertrophy compared to no exercise. When we look at if we really want to get the most out of hypertrophy, there are a few variables we could look at manipulating. And the main one is the volume, the amount of work we're doing. So similar to how if we want to get stronger, we need to lift heavier weights. With hypertrophy, we need to do more work. So that could be viewed as more sets or more reps. But the amount of work we do is just the amount of stimulus we give our muscle saying to grow. So will someone build more muscle if they're doing 3 sets than one? Yeah, probably. Of course, that'll plateau out where there is a point that you have added benefits and there are eventually diminishing returns. That more isn't always better. Um, but when it comes to hypertrophy, that's the main variable we can use to load the muscle more, put it under, uh, make it work more so that we have a stronger stimulus to build muscle. But like you said, the amount of muscle someone builds, if they're just meeting the guidelines twice a week, um, you won't have to worry about revamping your entire wardrobe.
That'll be awesome. Well, it's not because that's part of the fun of the game, just to earn every storm possible to get a little bit more gains. But the topic of volume can be of worms by itself. So I think it's beyond the scope of these conversations to go on that particular one. But in regards to hypertrophy, before we dig into strength, mostly power, but also endurance, which I think we didn't cover in the first track of this conversation again. In regards to hypertrophy, there's also this narrative that perhaps women and men need to train differently because of their type. Also, perhaps women again in the menopause, before menopause and during menopause, need to train differently because of
Yeah.
hormones, that they need to train heavier, or some people say that need to train
Yeah.
lighter. With the findings that you guys had in this position stance, would you say that?
Yeah, and so on this, the position stand only kind of covers it at a high level, but the long and short is: do women need to sync their training to their menstrual cycle or to whether they're pre or postmenopausal? No, you do not need to change your training just because you are in the luteal phase or because you're going through menopause. You do not need to change your training. the there's no evidence that shows it is out of whole better to train one way with certain hormones circulating versus another. What I would say is that individuals need to listen to their body. This is real biology. It going on in our bodies and in women's bodies in particular, there, right? Where whether it is going through a menstrual cycle or through menopause, perimenopause, and when that's happening, the individual experience is so different, where you might be having a poor sleep because you were having hot flashes all night. You might have some extra muscle soreness. Are these symptoms consistent across the board for everyone? No. So we're not going to make recommendations for the population at large because it's experienced so uniquely by all these individuals. So, what I would really encourage is one of the main principles we focus on in this position stand. There are three: progressive overload, individualization, and specificity. The individualization is maybe even the most important. We're similar to how we're talking about how we would, train or coach or work with someone who's new to training. We need to individualize that program to the person. And it's okay. You're not going to miss out big time if one day you have to, take your foot off the gas a little bit, or if you feel you can go a little bit harder because of how you're feeling. So, no, you do not need to train different based on the evidence on where those hormones are circulating. And I'm sorry, it cut out a bit during the first part of your question of something between men and women if they need to train. I didn't hear it cut out briefly. So sorry, I didn't catch the first part of that.
Yeah, sure, of course. The question is that there's also this current narrative in some people in the field that because there are differences in the fiber specific, let's say women have more type 1 fibers than men, they need to train differently than men because of these anatomical differences, which in some research they do exist, but that does not necessarily imply that there's a need to train differently.
Yeah, you're right. The anatomical differences certainly there are between men and women. That's one where again, sure to be individual, but I think the biomechanics of that. Well, would a squat look different between a man and a woman? Maybe, but I don't think, like, say, with how the femur's angled with the hips, like, is that going to be different in men and women? Yes. Does it substantially change how you're programming at a population level? No, in my opinion.
And I think that particular point of view, at least, again, it kind of gives us peace of mind. The most important thing we need to reinforce in people is to train and to find the, but I would say pleasure, not exactly
Yeah.
pleasure because it's not a good feeling to have a bar on your back or whatever, but the enjoyment of resistance training. And before, or well, moving on to strength, I think it's interesting to note the, let's say, paradigm shift in the maybe last 10 years, perhaps. We used to think that for strength, we needed to train maybe in the range of 5 to 8 reps, for hypertrophy, 8 to 12, and then everything beyond that, endurance, which I think is helpful, but can be misleading. How would you frame this particular way of thinking nowadays with the information that we have and with all the new data that has come out in the last couple of years?
Yeah, you're right. There has been. That's funny. That's cool. I've just seen the comments now, and I
We
see
do
that.
have one from Scott Forrest, my man,
I
Scott
know, and I was
Forrest.
going to say,
Yeah.
anyone who watches this, definitely, Dr. Forbes, thanks for the question. But anyone watching this, that's truly a great researcher to go follow, someone who's actually doing the work in many fields. Can creatine reduce muscle soreness? You're probably better to answer that than I am. As for creatine would be number one overall in my list of safest, most effective supplements. Does it reduce muscle soreness? Um, Going back in a few years in my reading on this topic, but my understanding, if anything, there were some trials where there were like perceived muscle soreness or like DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness, and um, yeah, I can't say with confidence if there's been newer work, or I should say where the totality of the evidence is right now. So I'd have to get back to you on my thoughts on that one. But yes, highly recommend checking out Dr. Forbes' work to anyone interested in this area. And Daniel, to your question, remind me if I miss anything here, but yeah,
But
around the shifting paradigm of reps for strength versus hypertrophy. Yeah, and maybe just to kind of, for those unfamiliar, for a long time we thought there was a strength endurance continuum where, to get stronger, we lifted heavy, and for hypertrophy we had this middle rep range where we would lift 6 to 12 reps, and that was the area we could maximize hypertrophy. And beyond that, over 20 reps, that's muscular endurance. And I think really what's been better understood now with several studies in both trained and untrained individuals from multiple groups around the world is that, particularly for that hypertrophy component, that rep range is less important than once thought to be. You can build muscle with a wide range of reps and ergo loads. So can you build muscle with heavy weights? Yes. Can you build muscle with light weights? Yes, you can. The key is that volume or work that we are talking about, where in each case you're training with a high degree of effort. So if you're lifting something heavy, that might be only 3 or 4 reps. If you're training with something lighter, that may be 20 reps. But in both cases, if you are going near failure, we'll call it, where you can't do another repetition, if you're approaching that failure point, there isn't a difference seen in how much muscle someone will build, whether trained or untrained.
I think one question that arises from that, specifically for hypertrophy and also for strength, but more for hypertrophy, it's, let's say, the impact on volume load if we train for hypertrophy within the, I don't know, let's say 4 to 6 rep range, which is close, with close proximity to failure, of course. The volume load, if we compare that to, let's say, 12 to 15 reps, would be significantly higher do you think this is something we need as practitioners to take into account, volume load in regards to training with certain specific rep range, uh, talking about hypertrophy? Or as long as it's, sorry to interrupt, as long as
Yeah,
we're close to failure, it really does not make a big difference.
I think volume load is a great concept. To have in mind when monitoring overall training load. Will that total volume load or work, however we're going to define it in resistance training, differ? But yes, and it is interesting that you sometimes, in some of the work that's been done, you can actually get higher amounts of volume load when you're training with the lower weights. Because if you think about someone with 90% of their one rep max versus 30%, completing a full rep at 90% is a lot. And you might not fully max out everything you have. Whereas with 30%, you could actually do a couple more reps, even if you wouldn't have enough to do 90% one time. So the volume load is a great concept. Is it relevant to trainers working with most individuals? I would say no. Monitoring the load, the number of sets and reps you're doing, um, is sufficient. But I certainly think that characterizing the amount of work someone is doing and gauging, if it's a heavier week or not for them, is super important. Is super important, but you're quickly entering a range or an area where, again, it's not the majority of people who will benefit from having this front of mind.
Totally. And I wanted to give a little bit more space and less for muscle power because I came across this. I don't know what to call this. It's like a really brief paper from for Phillips, of course, from the ACSM. It's called
Yeah,
Anti-Frail: Why Muscle Powers Matters in Aging. And I wanted
yeah,
to ask you about more on your views currently on why muscle power is most, let's say, relevant for older adults, and
yeah.
why we shouldn't really be afraid of training for muscle power, because I know, I understand it can be scary. Like you're telling me that I need to be explosive in my lifts. What does it actually mean in practice? And what are the key health benefits from training in this particular way?
Yeah, so great point. And we talked about the findings of this position stand, but just overall, this is something I found most exciting. One of the things I found most exciting about the results we came into here. One, I would say, what's the difference? So strength is just how much force we can generate, right? What's the maximum amount of force that we can produce? And when we think about why power is so important, well, let's look at what power is. Power is how, not just the amount of force we produce, but the time we take to produce it. So there's an element of time with power. And why power is so important, I would say, is imagine an older adult or anyone falling. How do we catch our fall? Right? When we stick our leg out, it's not just a matter of can we catch our body weight, it's can we do that quick enough to actually prevent ourselves from falling. So there is an element of speed that's super important, particularly for older adults. And something that I was really intrigued to see with our results here in synthesizing data was that it was actually for some of the functional outcomes. Power training did have an advantage over just traditional resistance training. Power training meaning that the lifts were performed as quickly as possible. So the individual in the concentric phase, picture that coming up from a squat or raising a barbell in a bench press, or the upwards part of a push up. When that is done as quickly as possible, we define that as power training, and really having that emphasis on moving quickly was beneficial for some of these functional endpoints that we looked at. So, and I mean, that is obviously we're synthesizing work done by many others in this position stand, but increasingly so you see the randomized trials and others meta-analyses showing that power training does have a real value for aging and frail individuals.
I think more in a pragmatical way or
Yeah.
sense, how would we practitioners apply all these findings, let's say for a training program as a whole? Do we
Yeah.
need to, because in this paper, the frailty one, it mentions that they recommend to first focus on hypertrophy, then strength, and then power. Do you think that's a better recommendation for the general population, just to be safe than sorry? Or perhaps we could include hypertrophy, muscle power, and strength in the same program, let's say on different days of the week?
Yeah. And so I think, since you asked about the general population, important to realize that the general population, the person who's either sporadically or not sporadically exercising or not doing any exercise at all, they're going to improve all three of those just by doing any training. If there's an added benefit, and how can we practically apply this? Based on the data that we were had, the recommendation we came down to was exercising within 30 to 70% of your one repetition max. So for reference, that would be, imagine a weight you can lift, call it like 20 to 10 to 20 times. If so, it's not super heavy, but something in that range, moderate weight that you are lifting as quickly as possible during that concentric phase, that shortening phase. That would be the recommendation we made based on this data. But I think the idea of a moderate weight, moving it quickly, is really the practical application of how do we improve our muscle power with resistance training.
I think viewing it that way, it's really interesting and again, liberating because
Yeah.
at least most people, I'm sure, thinking about training for muscle power. Perhaps what comes to mind are Olympic lifts, which one by
Yep.
themselves are kind of scary.
Yeah.
Do you think a better way to frame it for the general population is just to lift whatever it is, even if it's a free weight or a machine or their own body weight, just
Sorry, Daniel, it cut out just right as you were saying that. Machine, free weight, body weight, and then it cut out.
yeah, don't worry, these things happen. I'm well aware of that. If that would be a better recommendation, let's say to calm people down, to give them again peace of mind, that they can do whatever they want to, whatever they
Yeah.
prefer, free weights, machines, I don't know, even resistance bands, but just with the intention of moving them as quickly as possible.
Yes, absolutely. And that is, I think it's a very, it's a very feasible thing to incorporate. If you're already, going to the gym and starting to practice resistance training, as you want to control the movement, but if you just know, hey, whenever I'm doing that concentric phase, so is that standing up from a squat, whether that be a barbell squat, whether it's with an elastic band, body weight, maybe it's a leg press, that contraction phase, just do that as quickly as possible. And you control the movement, of course, but I think it is great idea to have that focus on performing the movement rapidly. And it goes back to the principle of specificity, right? Where you adapt to what you train with. And if that's heavy weights, then you'll be able to maximize how strong you get. If that's moving quickly, you'll be able to enhance how powerful you get. So it's a great thing, I think, for people to incorporate into just the cadence of how they do repetitions with any exercise.
Well, close to the end of the conversation, I have a couple of questions. More so, of course, findings of the, but also your experience, researcher and as a coach. The first one is, what do you think, in your experience, are the most common misconceptions that need to die right now to let people know that strength training is safe? It's a great thing that they can do for their health.
Yeah.
What are the most common misconceptions regarding resistance training in your experience?
Yeah, well, so we actually already covered one earlier, which was around
The
like
hypertrophy
just
one, right?
yeah, just what's a misconception is that you're going to get massive, and we're all going to be walking around looking like Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's like, you're not. um, Believe me, I wouldn't be as slender as I am if it was that easy. But it's so I think that is a very common misconception. And the second one I would say is is the injury risk, and this is particularly applicable to the older adults, and something I think is really important to address. And we do cover it just a bit in the discussion of this paper, but the actual injury rate, and health hazard of doing resistance training is extremely low. And actually, in most studies, the incidence of adverse events is lower than with aerobic training. I think people get scared, and understandably so, by the weight or the resistance, whether that be the band, the machine, the barbell. It is scary, and it's a foreign environment. It's not as intuitive, like we were saying, of just hopping on a bike or going for a run. But I think with any exercise, starting slow is actually one of the best pieces of advice I would give, where you don't need to jump into training like an animal. You can start with body weight. A lot of older adults, maybe like getting out of a chair might be tough, and that might be the lower body exercise, just chair stands, until they progress after a few weeks, or wall push-ups. If it's someone who has some more physical abilities and they want to start with a lightweight and they do 10 reps, they could do five more. Totally fine. Get comfortable with the movement, and make that comfort level uh, normal for you. That movement normal before you start worrying about progressing. Like we were saying, the biggest thing is just to keep coming back, and I think people will actually be surprised with how little you can do and have a benefit.
Totally, and I love the way that distance training it's getting a better understanding. I'm sorry for the from the general population because it can be really empowering. I can see it with my parents. They began resistance training at the gym. They are encouraged with it. So I'm really glad that it's not this niche thing that weird people like myself do to get oiled
Yeah,
up and pose in a thong in front of people. Course, I love bodybuilding, but it's glad to let people know that it's not just about that. And the last
yeah.
question, which segues a little bit from that prior point, is what would you like people to take away from the paper? The main thing that you think this is what I want people to know, beyond discussions on volume, on rep ranges, on
Yeah.
whatever key details that perhaps some practitioners, gym rats tend to focus the most. In your experience, what is the main thing that you would like people to know?
Anything is better than nothing. If we can take people from doing no resistance training to doing some form regularly, whether that be body weight, bands, training at home, that will be the single best thing. And I appreciate you saying it earlier. I do hope it has some of that liberating effect for practitioners, recognizing, and for individuals, that there are so many ways that we can practice resistance training and have meaningful benefit in our lives, that just getting doing something regularly will be a big change, but have a massive impact for most people in this world.
I guarantee I'm gonna make that one into a reel because other people need to hear that, and I hope that reaches the right ears. And just to finish off, Rob, because of course I
Yeah.
want to be respectful of your time. See, we have a little question. My good friend and colleague Juan Jerezano from Mexico.
Ah.
He is asking, would be important if the volume load is with a standardized program? I'm guessing it's in regards to hypertrophy. If
Mm.
we let's say have different volume loads, well, the same volume load but with different rep ranges, if this is standardized, would make a difference in regards to the outcome.
That's a great question. And actually, this is a series of studies that was done. It's been replicated by multiple groups, but originally, actually by Stu Phillips' group. And so, started with work by it was might have been Dan West actually that did the muscle protein synthesis work, but then Rob Morton led these high and low load programs where both untrained and trained, separate studies, people had. There were three groups in this study, so it wasn't just a high weight and low weight group, there was actually a third group that had their volume load matched. So it was low weight volume matched to the high load. And that was one where in muscle mass changes, the hypertrophy over this 16-week program, there was no difference. So whether it was volume load matched or not, it didn't impact in these individuals. Um, Again, I would say the volume load is a great concept, particularly if you're working with individuals like yourself. You do your program, to be mindful of how much stimulus you are going through each week, week over week. For the general population, it's probably not the most relevant concept to be focused on.
I guess that covers it. Just thank you once again for taking the time. It's really been really insightful, and I must admit I've enjoyed both of the conversations, but this one in particular, I felt a little bit more focused because I wasn't worrying about the audio issues and stuff, and that got me a little bit stressed out during the week. So again, Brad, it's really appreciated. I hope you had a great discussion.
This was awesome. Thank you so much, Daniel, again for setting this up, and everyone for the questions. This has been awesome, and look forward to staying connected with everyone online and following the other great conversations you lead.
It's a pleasure, man. Thanks for mentioning it. So I hope you have a great rest of the day. I hope we get to talk
Likewise.
again sometime soon. And thanks again, Brad.
Awesome. Take care. Talk to you soon.
See you, my man.